So, yeah, I think we just started. Yes, Shankar.
I have a question. Last week during our discussion, this came up, and I just want, so my understanding of what a sense sense perceiver, right,
Mm-hmm.
is that it's basically like a bare awareness. Is that a correct way? Like, for example, when my eye consciousness or my tactile consciousness, I mean, I can only, my eyes can only quote unquote see like just bare colors and shapes. It's really, that's all it sees, right? Everything else is superimposed on top of that. So is that correct to say it's like a bare perception?
Okay, well, in terminology, we get into some problems because sometimes some people translate munsum or prataksha, which is what we're calling direct perceiver here, translate that as bare perceiver, so naked perceiver or something like that. It means it perceives the object without needing any kind of image, like in conception, like a mental image. It just gets to the object itself. Whereas in conception, as opposed to direct perception, there is the intermediary of a mental image. So you could call it bare in that way. That's one way that the actual term direct perceiver is sometimes translated, okay. Bare perceiver or something like that. Okay, so why don't we begin with a little meditation as we do each week, and set our motivation, calm our mind, and sit quietly, relax your body, relax your mind. Put your mindfulness on the respiration in front. Of course, first of all, you have to see it, recognize it. But the subsequent moments are mindfulness of it, because mindfulness is a mental factor we'll learn later, which is keeping in mind something that had been recognized before, realized before. Here we're calming our mind of discursiveness, that is the tendency of other thoughts to be arising in your mind and for you to follow them. So to be mindful of the breathing, the respiration, if you're really focusing on that, the other thoughts will lose their life-sustaining energy in the sense that you're not paying attention to them. When the mind is slightly calmed, we're going to calm it further by turning our attention to the mental consciousness. Its contents, because the consciousness at first is very difficult to perceive. We can perceive the cloud-like thoughts in it. And try to sense the spaciousness of mind, its clear light nature, its sense of being non-obstructing to the arisal or the disappearance of thoughts back into it. Ideally, we're trying to get a mental image of the lack of obstructing contact, which is like space, just as in realizing emptiness. There's called a space-like meditation on emptiness. Then within this, instigate the sense of self, of me, I. Perhaps thinking of some time you were chastened, abused, insulted, falsely accused. Usually that's used as example, but maybe even justifiably accused. Sense of I still rises. Me here, the meditator, Just abide with that for some time and see or understand how it seems to be appearing. Again, it's not a visual appearance. I say appearance. It's a sense of I that seems to be existing from its own side. Not the merely imputed I. The way that one would, once you had identified it, the way that you would refute that or negate that is by using the logical reason. First establishing that the subject of the reason, the logical reason, the I, is empty of being inherently existent, because the I is neither inherently one with the aggregates, the five aggregates, the body, consciousness, and the other mental factors. It's not inherently one with them, nor inherently different from them. For this reason to work, resonate within our consciousness, we have to have what's called establishing conditions. We have to establish that the I is not inherently one with the aggregates and is not inherently different than the aggregates. And further, that whatever is not inherently one with the aggregates, not inherently different than the aggregates, is necessarily not inherently existent. And just positing that to our mind, just hearing that now, leaving some imprint to investigate it further in the future, recognize that this is one of the methods to establish emptiness, to realize emptiness, that our opportunity to get familiar with this now is due to our presently having a life of leisure and endowment, perfect human rebirth, due to the work our previous incarnations have created, the karma our previous lives have created to bring this juncture about that's so rare. It is so meaningful in that we can, in this lifetime, in theory, we could achieve liberation or enlightenment, or at least create the causes to make the realizations of the fundamentals of the path. So that in future lives, we would be already familiar, have a sense of an innate wisdom that senses the truth of these. For that purpose, I'm going to participate this morning in the study of Lorik, awareness and knowing, with that aim in mind of making these fundamental realizations, renunciation, bodhicitta, emptiness, on the way to creating the collection of necessary armor that we need to achieve the state of enlightenment. Out of a compassion and empathy for all sentient beings who have been depthlessly kind to us in the past, who are exactly equal with us in wanting to be free of suffering, wanting to be happy, exactly the same, who have exactly the same right to achieve that. They have exactly the same nature, Buddha nature, to achieve that. I'm going to participate this morning in order to eventually achieve enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. And then bring your attention back to the present.
Would you like prayers, Venerable George? My apologies for not knowing what we've been doing in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I apologize for not knowing what we've been doing the last couple of weeks. I'm not always totally consistent. If you have the praise of Manjushri.
I'm ready.
Ready? Yeah, put it up there. Okay. So, oh, nice. Okay. There we go. Okay. Homage to my Lama, my guru and protector, Venerable Manjushri, who holds at his heart a scripture symbolic of seeing all as it is, that scripture being the perfection of Wisdom Sutra, whose pure genius shines like the sun unclouded by the two obscurations, and who, with compassion like a father for his only child, teaches with the 60-fold eloquence of a Buddha all beings imprisoned in cyclic existence, who are groping in the darkness of ignorance and overwhelmed by suffering. You, Manjushri, whose thunder-like proclamation of the perfection of wisdom arouses us from the stupor of our afflictions and frees us from the iron chains of karma, who wields wisdom's sword, vanquishing the darkness of ignorance, hewing down our every sprout of suffering. You who are primordially pure, who have finished the 10 grounds, the complete embodiment of every excellence, whose princely body is graced with the 112 adornments, the 32 major marks and the 80 minor signs. O Manjushri, to you I bow, dispel the darkness from my mind. And then the next page has the mantra of red, yellow Manjushri. There's other Manjushris, there's white Manjushri and other Manjushris, but this is the Omara Patsanadi Manjushri. So we'll recite this mantra, Omara Patsanadi, 21 times, and then on one breath, take a deep breath, recite the syllable D, the final syllable. You could say in English, DHI, like in the mantra there in English. As we imagine it on the tip of our tongue, and at the end we'll swallow some saliva and imagine that syllable comes down to our heart and brings the blessing of quick wisdom. Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani. Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani. Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani. Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani, Om Arabazanani. Om With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness of my mind's confusion. Grant me the light of self-assured intelligence that I may see into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. Okay. So, oops, you want to get rid of that. We don't need that in. Oh, we don't need that right now. Yeah. We've done, there we go. Okay. How's everyone doing? Stephen appears out of the ether. There we go. So I asked if there were any questions before, but that was maybe before we started recording. Are there any questions from last time? Bob.
Yeah, let me ask about valid cognition, because, you know, for valid cognition, it has this word incontrovertible. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't think there's any sort of sensory knowledge or conceptual knowledge that I myself would feel comfortable putting the label incontrovertible on. You know, maybe Buddhas are incontrovertible, but for ordinarily humans, is valid cognition sort of like an idealistic goal that none of us can ever really achieve?
I think, you know, one has to be aware of the Tibetan term. In this case, what's being translated as incontrovertible is milua. Lua. Milua means not. Mi means not. Lua means, let's say, fallible or not fallible, not mistaken. Well, say lua means, could mean, you could say it as mistaken or fallible. Usually we reserve the word mistaken in this present day English translation of these terms to mean being mistaken with respect to the appearing object. Lua means being mistaken with respect to the object that you're engaging. So it doesn't necessarily mean incontrovertible in the sense that you are, you're taking to the, sort of logical or grammatical extreme of being, only a Buddha could achieve infallibility like that, or incontrovertibility. It means that your I consciousness, if you're talking about an I valid direct perceiver, has sufficient understanding of the object, the color, shape, or color, that if someone were to tell you that the red apple that you're seeing is not actually red, that it's green, you would not be swayed by that. That you've developed an assurance that that is actually how it is. If it were a mistaken eye consciousness, if you had some defect of your eye, or if you had color blindness and you thought that the red, what a person with, I'm not sure if there's different kinds of color blindness, but generally a person with color blindness, what color would they see an apple as? Gray or green?
Since I'm red-green colorblind, in a sense I can answer that. In a sense I can't, because I don't know what other people see. But for me, what it is that the colors tend to blend together. And so I don't distinguish distinctly colors that other people see distinctly. An example of this is that we had a lot of forest fires around Santa Fe for a while, and a lot of trees died. And so a lot of people were very upset because the evergreens all looked brown. But to me, it didn't look like they had changed at all. It looked like the same beautiful forest I'd always seen. So it was actually a benefit. But I will see a car going down, and I will say, look, and I'll mention some color, and they will say that's not that color at all. So I think it's mainly a confusion. And I think to me it feels like I don't have the vividness that other people do. Whereas for some people, like a certain color of red will really stand out of a background. Whereas for me, it blends in with it.
So if I ask you on your bookshelf behind you, which everyone can see, to go over and get the red volume, you would go like,
well,
you have to be more precise than that, right?
Well, pure reds I can tend to see. It's really when you start mixing colors, that they tend to look the same. And they don't stand out as different.
So here, when we talk about infallibility, or what's the word that you? Incontrovertible. What was the word that you said?
Incontrovertible.
Incontrovertible.
Cannot be overturned. And for me, the reason why I say that, this color blindness is a perfect example. I will look at a color and it will look incontrovertibly to be one thing, and then everybody comes and tells me I'm wrong.
Right. Well, so the defining characteristic of incontrovertible here is that other conventional consciousnesses would agree that you could not be contradicted by other conventional consciousnesses if it was incontrovertible. There might be some people that had eye defect, like your own color blindness. But the general consensus is that that apple is red if it is actually red. There are green apples and there are yellow apples and so forth. Let's leave that for a second, but we'll come back to it because we're going to be talking again about prime cognition, or another way of calling it valid cognition today. So Amanda had her hand up.
Yes, I've got a comment and a question. So the comment is, some weeks back you mentioned the mind of bodhicitta, and after that I noticed somewhere else the mind of ignorance, the mind of attachment, the mind of aversion, the self-cherishing mind. And when I started to think about how I'd been thinking of all of those things, I've been thinking of them as I'm ignorant, I'm attached, I'm averse. But when you said that, the mind of bodhicitta, and then I noticed these other things, the mind of attachment and so on, it made me look at it like I'd look at my biceps or my triceps, like this component that does stuff. And it helped me see how I had been identifying myself as, ignorant, for example, whereas I could say when a thought came or something, I could go, oh, that's the mind of ignorance. And somehow it enabled me to hold it at arm's length and sort of start being more productive about it. So I just wondered if you could give me some feedback. Am I on the right track or have I got confused?
Yeah, I think that's good because oftentimes when we think of ourself, we think, I'm a loser, or I'm great, I'm brilliant, I'm beautiful, I'm ugly, identifying some and exaggerating either some quality or fault that arises within our mind or our body as being us, the essence of us. As you say, all of these are components. We do have instances of anger. Probably even the most compassionate of us here have moments of anger where we might, wish others ill or, act in a non-compassionate way. But we have to recognize when we start to understand how the person is imputed upon the aggregates. Amanda is the person imputed, is the being imputed upon her 5 aggregates. So there are instances of Amanda being this or that, but that's not Amanda's nature, fundamental nature. The fundamental nature is being non-inherently existent, and in particular, the nature of her mind is being clear light. What we say the conventional nature of her mind is that it is not stained by any of the faults or temporary qualities, sort of what we usually think of. They can come and go, and that our goal is to be able to transform the nature of our mind so that it has developed omniscience, so that we have only good qualities, perfect qualities ad infinitum, forever, to be able to benefit others. So when you were talking about, you were using the word mind with each of those qualities. You said the mind of ignorance, the mind of bodhicitta. You could say the mind of bodhicitta, because generally in our use of the words now, mind is what we call chitta in Sanskrit, or sem in Tibetan. That it means a primary mind, primary consciousness. So bodhicitta is a special mental primary consciousness, whereas ignorance is not a primary mind. Ignorance is a mental factor. And so attachment is a mental factor, whereas self-cherishing, you said self-cherishing mind again. Sometimes we translate it that way, but it's rangchenzengi lo, which means awareness, or Lama Yeshe used to call it an attitude. It's a stain of the mind. It's not just a mental factor. You'll find self-cherishing mind amongst the mental factors. It's not a primary mind. It's a general attitude, which having grasped at the sense of the self, out of the mental factor ignorance, desiring that self to be enhanced and to be recognized and to cherish it, like we cherish something that's very precious to us. So there's 3 different words there: mind, mental factor, and attitude. So it might be worth just, thinking about that a little. We'll talk about it more. So let's get back to our actual material here. So who can remind us where we finished last time? Bob, okay.
Yeah, we had just finished on page 14. We had just gone down to where we're just getting ready to begin number 2, mental direct perceiver.
Okay, thank you. Is it okay with everyone? Bob has the right. Okay, so right before this, we talked about mental direct perceivers, what that meant to be a mental direct perceiver. This is from what Bob says, as we just had talked about that, we hadn't gotten to the divisions yet. So with respect to the second, mental direct perceivers, there are 2 parts: definition and divisions. So just to go over the definition of a mental direct perceiver is that which is generated upon independence upon a mental sense power or mental faculty. You don't have to say sense power. The word in Tibetan is what do we say? As I say, indriya. Wangpo means powerful. Sometimes Wangpo just means power. Sometimes it means faculty. Here it means the mental faculty that is its own uncommon empowering condition. What that meant, as we said before, that in general, there are 3 conditions necessary for a consciousness to arise. So using the example of, let's say, the I consciousness, even though we're talking about mental consciousness here, say you have the I faculty or the I sense power, which is a subtle matter, which is not itself consciousness. You need some consciousness to enter into that. Usually that's called the immediately preceding condition, a consciousness that has existed before and is able to enter into that organ, and you need the object condition that is the impinging of the apple, the image of the apple on your sense power. So here, when we talk about the mental sense power or the mental faculty, it's not a physical faculty like it is for the other 5 senses. The mental faculty is itself also a previous moment of consciousness. So that which the definition of a direct mental perceiver is that which is generated in dependence upon a mental sense power that is its own uncommon empowering condition. So that's not the uncommon empowering condition of the other senses. The I sense direct perceiver, its uncommon empowering condition is its subtle matter, the faculty, the I faculty, which is subtle matter. Here, the mental faculty is not the brain. You might think by extension that the brain would be the mental faculty or the mental sense power. It's not the physical, there's no physical analog there. It's just a previous moment of consciousness. And besides that, it is a consciousness that is other knower that is free from conceptuality and non-mistaken. Okay, so the non-mistaken means that it is not mistaken with respect to its appearing object, the mental consciousness. When you talk about the I consciousness not being mistaken with respect to its appearing object, that means the tree or the apple or whatever, is not mistaken for something else. Also for the mental consciousness, a mental direct perceiver, it is not mistaken with respect to its appearing object. So say, for instance, mental direct perceivers are, there is one instant of a mental direct perceiver when you see something, when you have a train of eye consciousness, you see a tree. The first instant of that is also perceived by the mental consciousness as a mental direct perceiver. But then the mental consciousness does not perceive what the eye is seeing after that, in that train of visual consciousness. The mental consciousness has one instant of direct, or let's say, mental direct perception of that object. And it is so short an instant that we are unaware of it. Only the Arya beings or the Buddhas can perceive that. So mental direct perceiver is that which is generated in dependence upon a mental sense power, mental faculty, that is its own uncommon empowering condition, and is a consciousness that is an other knower. That means it's not a self-knower, where we will talk about also self-knowing, Rangrik. Self-knowers look at the consciousness itself. Other knowers are consciousnesses that know something other than their own nature. So it is a consciousness that is an other knower, that is free from conceptuality. Although most mental consciousnesses in our experiences are conceptual, they know things via a mental image. Mental direct perceivers have no mental image. They're knowing something directly or barely, as someone said. Bob, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you know, so for an ordinary person, these mental direct perceivers are very unusual states. Because I think for an ordinary person, this man in the street, he would probably say the only kind of minds I have or mental consciousnesses are conceptual. And so these mental, you know, and in fact, when we look at the Buddhist examples, the only thing that I think I know of are the yogic perceivers, and also the, well, I guess there is this self-knowing thing, which again is an unusual state that most people in the West wouldn't recognize as a, or wouldn't be aware of.
From the, let's say, from the point of view of Prasangika, the self-knowers that we're assuming here to be part of the panoply of things, don't really exist.
Exactly.
So, but we do have other examples of mental direct perceivers. In dream, when you have a clear dream, not at the point when you're about to wake up and you're thinking about what's happening, but that dream state is said to be a mental direct perceiver. And also clairvoyance, mental clairvoyance that knows, for instance, the state of others' minds, past and future lives. Those are said to be mental direct perceivers.
Okay, and can I just make one brief question about the other one you mentioned? I mean, there is this one you mentioned that supposedly when we're seeing some object with our sense consciousnesses, when we switch to thinking about that object, we have one brief moment where we directly see that object with our mind.
Right. It's not when we think about it. It takes place before we think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, but there's this transition period. Is that only belong to Prasangika tenets, or does it belong to all four schools? This one brief moment of mental direct perception.
I think the other schools, they have, you know, different. There's a sequence of different ideas about it, but generally the consensus, even in the Sautrantika, is that you have one instant of that, and
I
You're
mean,
going to
this
have
is
other
actually,
instance of it. Say, for instance, when you look at something, you have a train of visual consciousness. It's not just when you blink, but even if you're looking at something, your consciousness may go out of focus, your eye consciousness. And each time there's another train, there'll be one instant at the beginning of that. That the train of visual consciousness might be, I don't know how many shortest instance. It might be many, many millions of shortest instances, which might amount to a millisecond or something. And then you'll have another instant of mental direct perception, but it's just one instant, so that it remains amongst what are called consciousnesses to which an object appears but is not ascertained. The mental consciousness can't recall that it has that direct perception. And anyway,
but this one moment is actually huge from from a certain perspective, in the sense that it actually, for most ordinary Westerners, we tend to think of our mind as being disconnected with the real world. And in this one, by having this one mental direct perception, I mean, it puts us directly in contact. It puts our mind directly in contact with the real world, exactly the way that a sense consciousness does,
I'm
which
not sure
is pretty huge.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you mean by huge in extent.
Conceptually. I mean, it's a huge idea. I mean, because, from the West, from Descartes and everybody else, the mind-body problem, there's always this huge divide between our mind, how we think, and the real world. And so here in the Buddhist philosophy, you actually have a direct connection between our mind. It's acting exactly like a sense power for one moment, briefly, but it still does. There is a direct connection with the external world.
It's not acting like a sense power. It's actually perceiving what the eye consciousness is perceiving. It has that one instant of perception. Let's leave that. Otherwise, we'll never, because we haven't even gotten to the new material yet. So let's go on to the divisions. As Bob had said, where we were about to start, divisions. When mental direct perceivers are divided, there are three kinds of mental direct perceivers. Valid cognizers that are mental direct perceivers, or you could say valid mental direct perceivers. You don't have to say the word cognizer twice, because you have cognizer and perceivers twice in the sentence. Subsequent mental direct perceivers, or subsequent cognizers that are mental direct perceivers, or you say it the other way around, mental direct perceivers that are subsequent, and awarenesses to which an object appears but is not ascertained that are mental direct perceivers. So that's pretty, it goes along with what we said before when we talked about direct perceivers. Generally, we could say direct perceivers are three kinds. Valid direct perceivers, subsequent direct perceivers, and direct perceivers that something has appeared to you, but you didn't pay sufficient attention to it that it could lead to a subsequent memory. It's called a direct perceiver to which an object appears, but the object is not ascertained. Ascertained means that it can lead to a subsequent memory that you saw it or heard it or thought that your mind perceived it. Amanda, you have your hand up again. Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick one. Is number one the locomotive and number two the carriages in that previous analogy? The train and the...
Yes.
Okay.
The valid cognizer is like the engine.
Yeah.
And the subsequent cognizers are like the subsequent moments of that train of perception, because it might last, a couple of instants, and then there'll be a blank, and then there'll be another train where there will be a first instant that is a valid cognizer. The third division here, we talk about inattentive perception. It's another way of translating in fewer words, an awareness to which an object appears but is not ascertained. You could say an inattentive cognizer, inattentive perception. So the examples we gave before. So in the case of mental direct perception, that would be that one instant at the beginning of a train of visual consciousness, let's say, or hearing consciousness, the one instant when the mental consciousness perceives that directly, but that is just one instant. It is not sufficient to leave an impact in our mental consciousness that you ascertained it. So that's called an inattentive perception. Generally, you could say, if you leave off that case, inattentive perceptions, you could say mental direct perceivers are, they realize their object, right? Can I say that? They've realized their object. Why is that? Well, leaving off inattentive perception, they either are valid or subsequent. Both valid cognition and subsequent cognitions realize their objects. They are, what's the word, Bob? Incontrovertible, right? They realize their object. So, so now examples. The first, a valid cognizer that is a mental direct perceiver is, for example, the first moment of a clairvoyance that knows others' minds. Why is only the first moment a valid cognizer? Because the definition of a valid cognizer is that it has to be fresh or initial, right? Just the first moment, like the engine. The second, the example of the second, which is a subsequent cognizer that is a mental direct perceiver, is, for example, the second moment of a clairvoyance that knows another's mind. I mean, here we're giving a sequence of mental direct perceiver. If you talk about the mental direct perceiver that is just that one instant, it doesn't have any subsequent cognition of that. The third, an awareness to which an object appears but is not ascertained, that is a mental direct perceiver, is, for example, a mental direct perceiver apprehending sound in the continuum of a person whose mind is especially attracted to a beautiful form. So what would be an example of a mental direct perceiver apprehending a sound? Does a mental direct perceiver directly perceive a sound? Shanka, you were saying something?
I'm sorry, what would you repeat your question again, please?
So here, the example, it says, an awareness to which an object appears but is not ascertained, that is a mental direct perceiver. So an inattentive mental perception. Example, a mental direct perceiver apprehending a sound in the continuum of a person whose mind is especially attracted to a beautiful form. That means visual form. So a little bit doubt about this. How long would a mental direct perceiver apprehend a sound?
Just that first instant, right?
It would seem so, yeah. So there's a little bit, generally you could, one of the other examples that's usually given is just the first instant of a mental perception apprehending a form or a sound or something like that, because it is inattentive. It only lasts an instant. I'm not quite sure what Purbachok's point is.
I mean, isn't this related to what you were saying, a response to Bob's question about, you know, when you see something with your eye consciousness, your mental consciousness also for the very first instant also engages with the same thing, right? Yeah,
that's the general common person, as Bob said, common man in the street, although they don't recognize that because it's inattentive. That's the general kind of mental perception we have. Other than that, ordinary people have dreams, clear dreams when you're in deep sleep. Not in deep sleep, when you have, what's that, rapid eye movement sleep, but it is a clear appearance to the mind. That's called a mental direct perception. So that can last for many instants. And clairvoyance and other kinds of states like that. So now, self-knowing direct perceivers. Those of you who studied tenets remember something about self-knowers. In Tibetan, Rang Rik. Rang means self, like we say Rang Luk, our own tradition, self-tradition. Rang means self, Rik means knower. So the definition of a self-knower is that which has the aspect of an apprehender. Again, does that sound completely foreign to some of you? Some of you who didn't hear tenets? Yarpo, do you know, have you heard that before? That which has the aspect of an apprehender. Could you explain that?
No.
Okay, good.
I couldn't explain it and I haven't heard it.
Okay, good. Good, honest case. Monk, right? So, so generally when we talk about most consciousnesses, other than self-knowers, they are called other knowers. They know something other than themselves. They are said to look outward. You know, like so the I consciousness isn't looking back at the consciousness itself. It's looking out at the tree or the orange or the, you know, the car or whatever. Those are called other knowers. Here in Sautrantika, Chittamatra, most of the Chittamatra, or at least some of the Chittamatra, and some of the Svatantrika, Majjhimaka, they accept the existence of self-knowers, that is, consciousnesses that know themselves. Now, you might argue that a consciousness can know itself because, like in our meditation, we're investigating our mental consciousness, hopefully, if we, you know, disregard the senses, our mental consciousness is looking at the mental consciousness, right? But the way that's explained according to, say, Prasangika, is that we have a stream of consciousness that we're aware of. One instant of consciousness is looking at the previous instant of consciousness. It's not looking at itself. The classic example that's given in the Bodhisattva Charivatara by Shantideva, I think also in the sutras, is that a sword, the blade of a sword cannot cut itself. You know, like say your kitchen knife can cut the carrot, but however you twist the knife around, the knife can't cut itself. You might argue that if you have an aluminum knife, you can twist it around and one point of the blade can cut another part of the blade, but that's like the example of one instant of mind looking at a previous instant of mind. It's not itself. One point of the flexible sword or knife can cut another point but it can't cut itself. So when we talk about the definition of a self-knower, this is one definition. There are other definitions that give, you know, a slightly different sort of taste to it. That which has the aspect of an apprehender. So what does that mean, has the aspect? What is appearing to that self-knower, according to these tenets, is an aspect. Same thing with your I consciousness. What is appearing to the I consciousness is the aspect of a tree or the aspect of some visual objects, color, shape, or color, or whatever. The mental consciousness, what its aspect is an apprehender. That means a consciousness. It is knowing itself. That which has the aspect of an apprehender, when you talk about direct perceiver, self-knowing direct perceiver, is free from conceptuality and is non-mistaken.
So
So let me ask some of you who've studied a little bit.
So would you repeat that again? You said to a self-knower, the aspect that appears is
an apprehender. That means its state of being an apprehender. It knows that it is knowing. So the Sautrantikas, Chittamantras, and Svatantrika Madhyamikas who accept this, they posit that that's necessary to have a memory that you saw something. Okay? What do you think about this, Yarpel? To say that you saw the tree, is that, to remember the tree, you don't need a self-knower. You need the other knower, I consciousness. I consciousness in general is an other knower. It knows something other than itself. It knows a material object outside of itself. Because of that, you could remember the tree, it said, because you've seen the tree. To remember that you saw the tree, I remember seeing that tree. The Sautrantika posits that in order to know that you saw the tree, you have to have something that is apprehending the seeing. Here we're not talking about the mental direct perceiver any longer. We're talking about self-knowers in general. Self-knowers know their own entity of knowing. There's said to be a faculty which is even in the case of I consciousness, the self-knower is a mental consciousness. It's not an I consciousness because it doesn't depend on the dominant condition of the I organ. It's an entity of that consciousness which is focused inward toward the consciousness, knows nothing else, doesn't know the content of the consciousness, just knows that it is knowing. Yarpo, what do you think?
My personal thought is the fact that it assumes that this mind or this consciousness of being observing is a permanent, unchanging thing, rather than recognizing that it's changing moment to moment. And when you're looking at it, you're just remembering, like you said before, that you're relating to the previous moment, rather than seeing something as solidly continuing.
First of all, it has no conceptuality.
Yeah.
Because it's direct perceiver. Self-knowers are self-knowing awareness are non-conceptual. So it's not thinking about this is impermanent or this is that. It's just experiencing. So let me ask a question, Nadine. What about if I have a conception, if I'm thinking about something in my mind, my mental consciousness, so it's a conception, is there a mental self-knower present at that time?
I don't know. I think according to the law, Sautrantika, probably yes, but I don't know.
Yeah. So, Rowena, what do you think? So here it says the self-knower is non-conceptual. So there might be some doubt. How can you have a self-knower of a conception? You have to unmute so I can, even though you're not saying anything, just so I can see that you're aware that I've asked you a question.
Well, I mean, it seems
you're still muted, Rowena.
Grasping at a meaning that you've had before.
Say that again.
I think you're grasping, or you could say a meaning generality or something, but the perception you're talking about is grasping based on something you've known before?
I'm not sure what you're thinking. So you have a conception.
Yes.
Let's say you're thinking about who's the president?
I think we've got Biden right now.
We got Biden. Okay, not Trump. We've got Biden. You're thinking of Biden. You have maybe you're thinking of his body. You're thinking of his standing up. That's a conceptual mind. It's a mental consciousness, right? It's a conceptual mental consciousness, not a direct perceiver.
Conceptual.
Conceptual. So is there present a mental self-knower? Is there a self-knower that's knowing that state of mind?
I think in my case, I observe my thoughts, so I'm there. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
You can't use your experience here because from present Gika point of view,
there's
it
no,
doesn't exist.
It doesn't.
But-
The self-knower doesn't. My self-knower is just a conglomeration of opinion, so it doesn't exist at all.
Let's say this: if I ask you, did you think of Biden? You could later say, yeah, I was thinking of Biden. Not just that you imagined, but you were thinking about it. That implies for Sautrantika and these other two schools, that implies that there's a consciousness that's aware of the fact that you were thinking. Now, my question is, how could that not be a conception? Stephen, you had some assurance about the other point. How about this? Is that a conceptual mind? Is that self-knower a conceptual mind because it's knowing a conceptual mind?
I don't believe so. I try and do what Rowena does and just sort of look at my own consciousness. And so I'm convinced that I'm aware, so I have a self-knower active. It may be in the background, so I don't believe it's like a conceptual consciousness that's going on, but I do believe I can have a non-conceptual consciousness going on simultaneously while I'm thinking about something. For example, when you asked us to think about Biden, I thought about Biden and his aviator glasses. and then a few moments later, I remembered that I was thinking about Biden. I remembered that I was thinking about Biden.
Right. Or the consciousness was thinking. So
and while I was thinking about Biden, there was no conceptuality going on about, am I thinking about Biden? I was just thinking about Biden. So that's why I believe, I know it's like a reflection.
So what do you believe?
I believe that you can have a non-conceptual self-knowing consciousness even while you're engaged in conceptuality.
Yeah. So the tenets say that although so certainly in a perception, the self-knower is a perception. Not only that, even in a sense consciousness, sense perception, let's say I consciousness, I direct perceiver, the self-knower is a mental consciousness. It's called a mental consciousness because it doesn't depend on the empowering condition of the I consciousness. I consciousness only arises in dependence upon the I faculty, right? The I self-perceiver is mental, but and then further in the case of conception, the mental self-perceiver is itself not conceptual, even though it's knowing the mental consciousness, which itself is conceptual, which is dependent upon a mental image. It's said to be non-conceptual. So,
Venerable George?
Yes.
When you were talking to me about Biden, the other day I looked at Biden, I sort of Biden, but he had this red tie on, and that was very direct. I didn't
It's very
have,
disconcerting because that's what Trump always wore, right?
I know. Well, later I can see why I was had a feeling of just being disconcerted. But he had a red tie on, and I just go, red tie, you know. So
Okay.
that's direct. That's direct, right? The rest of
So
it.
how do we actually remember that we were thinking? According to Prasangika, you don't need a self-knower to know that you were thinking, simply by the force of having seen the object, you know that you saw it. So we'll go into the, you can check in the explanations in the Prasangika why that refute the need for a self-knower. But here we're, according to Sautrantika, this is one of the divisions of direct perceivers, right? Sense direct perceivers, mental direct perceivers, and self-knowing direct perceivers. Right?
Venerable George,
Yes.
I think, it seems to me an easier way of saying it is that the self-knower is a consciousness that's like the record button on our Zoom. It's always recording what's going on with all the other consciousnesses. And it must be always present, according to the Sautrantika. Whenever we have a consciousness, we must have a self-knowing consciousness there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's built into the, for Sautrantika, it's built into the consciousness. It's the same nature of the consciousness. It's not like a separate entity that's looking at the consciousness. It's just the consciousness's ability to know that it is functioning. Okay, so that which has the aspect of an apprehender, so it's pointed, in other words, it's pointed inward. That's another expression that's used in some of the definitions of a self-knower. It's pointed inward, free from conceptuality. It's a direct perceiver and is non-mistaken. Okay, divisions. When self-knowing direct perceivers are divided, there are three: valid cognizers, subsequent cognizers, and inattentive perceptions that are self-knowers. So self-knowers that are valid, that are subsequent, both of them realize their object, and self-knowers that are inattentive. So how could that be? Self-knower that is inattentive, and they give examples here. So the first example of a self-knower that is a valid cognizer is, for example, the first moment of a self-knower, of a self-knowing direct perceiver that experiences an I consciousness. So it's just talking about the I consciousness, the entity of that consciousness knowing itself. The first moment is a valid direct perceiver that is a self-knower. The self-knowing direct perceiver in the second, a self-knowing direct subsequent cognizer, just the subsequent moments of that. The second, third, fourth moment of that train of self-knowing. It's called subsequent because it's not fresh. Okay. Examples of the third. So here, this is interesting. So we're talking about an inattentive self-knower. What could that be? You won't find it generally in any of the sense consciousnesses, but you can talk about, or let's say in the direct perceivers. But here, example of an awareness to which an object appears but is not ascertained, inattentive perception that is a self-knowing direct perceiver, or in other words, a self-knower that is inattentive. So example, self-knower in the continuum of a samkhya. Do you know what a samkhya is? Christine?
It's one of those Indian philosophical schools, right? I can't remember the exact,
Yeah. So Stephen, you're going to elaborate?
Yeah, so they are non-Buddhists and they are followers of Patanjali. You might know some of them as yoga practitioners.
Yeah, well, yeah. Patanjali was, I think that Samkhya existed before Patanjali, but Patanjali also sort of codified the system. It's one of the Vedic systems, which nowadays a lot of people just call Hindu, non-Buddhist, indigenous Indian philosophies that existed prior to the Buddha, because the Buddha talked about them, and existed afterwards. I think there are still some people who are adherents of Samkhya philosophy. So for a Samkhya, here it says, a self-knowing direct perceiver in the continuum of a Samkhya, that experiences bliss as being a consciousness. So what's the implication here? Is bliss a consciousness? Or is bliss an object that consciousness knows?
This must be an object.
What's an experience?
Who said that? Who said experience? I heard someone underneath. I couldn't tell who was saying that. Yarpol, what is bliss? Is bliss a consciousness?
I think bliss is an experience.
Okay. Then, does that mean it's a consciousness or it's not a consciousness?
I don't think so.
You don't think what?
I don't think it is a consciousness. I think it's an experience.
Okay, let me ask you, we'll put it this way. Of the 5 aggregates, one of the aggregates is the feeling aggregate, right?
Yes.
What is the feeling aggregate?
Pleasant, unpleasant, neutral.
Those are the experiences of the feeling aggregate.
Yeah.
Feeling is a mental factor.
Okay.
One of the 5 omnipresent mental factors. We'll talk when we talk about the section about mind and mental factors. It's a mental factor. Feeling is a consciousness. It is that consciousness, that aspect of consciousness that experiences pleasure, pain, or indifference. So bliss, being the experience of extreme pleasure, is an object of consciousness. It is the experience of that. Bliss itself is consciousness. So for instance, when we talk about happy feeling, we can say blissful feeling. If I put it that way, that would make it more clear that is itself a mental factor that's experiencing bliss. You look like one of these great yogis of the past, Yarpol. There's a sort of like.
No, I'm just trying to pay attention to understand.
Okay, so when we talk about experiencing bliss, the way that it's phrased, it almost sounds like bliss is somewhere else and that we're looking at it or something like that. Mm. Actually, what happens is that in a consciousness, you have to think about this in your own experience. You know, can you have a blissful visual consciousness? Well, you might say, oh, I can have a painful visual consciousness when a mosquito gets stuck under my eyelid or something like that. That's not a visual consciousness. That's a tactile consciousness. If you see a beautiful person or a beautiful painting or a lovely sunset or something like that, is that a blissful visual consciousness?
No, I think it has to come with your mental consciousness is what interprets that as being, pleasant or unpleasant, and therefore it can be blissful.
Right. The bliss may be actually mental. If you think that something is beautiful or something. So you have to think about this. It is said that feeling is an omnipresent mental factor. So it's present in all consciousnesses that know an object. So you have to think about this. In the case of a Samkhya believes that bliss is not a consciousness. They're kind of like your initial thinking that bliss is something else and consciousness knows it, something, a different entity than itself. So for a Samkhya who's actually experiencing bliss, which is a consciousness, they don't, that they have, if they're holding in their tenets that it is not a consciousness, that the implication here is that shows that for them, that was an inattentive perception because they're not able to ascertain later that it was a consciousness. Doris is, yeah. Whoa, okay. So, what do you think? Anna, are you there? I see your smiling face, your picture, but Anna's sometimes cooking in the kitchen or vacuuming. How about?
No, I'm here. I'm here.
So
can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. So a self-knowing direct perceiver in the continuum of a Sakya that experiences bliss as being a consciousness. What does that mean?
Wow, I have no idea.
You have to think about it.
Let me just say, this is my...
Go on, sorry.
I just wanted to say, this is my first session that I've attended in this series. So I'm just getting used to the language.
Oh, okay. I thought I saw your...
I've been attending the Sunday
sessions.
Okay.
So that's where I recognize the picture from. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So I'm just sitting back and trying to absorb.
Yeah. Okay.
All this wisdom.
Excellent. Just leading some, like putting the primer coat on. Later you'll go into to be able to make it more deep. So
right.
Here we're talking about a particular kind of consciousness that the Sautrantika, Chittamatra, and Svatantrika Madhyamikas say is necessary. They call it self-knowing. That's knowing the entity of the consciousness. It's part of the consciousness. It's knowing that you are conscious. And here the example of a inattentive self-knower. Self-knower is this, autocognition, knowing itself. Inattentive. How can it be inattentive? Well, it's kind of it's a little bit stretching the logic because generally you would have to say that they are aware of that they are conscious of bliss. But here it's saying, according to their tenets, they say that bliss is something else. So if they keep on holding on to it's not the nature of the mind. So if they're holding on to that tenet, that they are unaware of the fact that their consciousness is experiencing bliss. Okay, you have to think. Let me get another example. Another example of a self-knower that's inattentive. Okay, a self-knower, direct perceiver in the continuum of a Vaisheshika. This is not the Vaibhashika that is the lowest of the Buddhist tenets. This, as Stephen and some others, as Shankar said, is another one of the Vedic philosophical schools. A self-knowing direct perceiver in the continuum of a Vaisheshika that experiences bliss as being consciousness. So they also don't accept, they're like the Samkhyas, right? That experiences bliss as being a consciousness. So in other words, they are unaware of the fact that the bliss is a consciousness. You might say, and some of you, like Yarpul and some of the others said, oh yeah, you were sure, maybe bliss is something else other than the consciousness. Here it's talking about the self-knower supposedly experiences that. If if for them, because their mind is so centered on their tenant that it's something other than the consciousness, they are inattentive of that. It appears, but is not ascertained. The third example, the self-knower in the continuum of a nihilist, another one of the Vedic schools, you could say. Nowadays, we talk about nihilists in the West also, right? Nihilists. But this is talking about the Vedic schools. The self-knower in the continuum of a nihilist that experiences an inferential cognizer as being a valid cognizer. So what's the implication there? Shankar, do you know?
Well, to believe that nothing exists, right?
Well, not sure. Let's say, for instance, example of some nihilistic nihilists' tenets.
There is no such
there are
thing
no
as
karmic consequences for your
Right.
actions, so forth and so on. You know, like famous nihilist who was, in modern terminology, was a pedophile. So he saw no problem in having sexual relationship with his daughter. This is a very famous incident in one of these nihilists, because he, according to his view, there was no karmic consequence of that. Probably a lot of people, a lot of criminals have that kind of, you know, you don't have to be that Vedic school. You could just say a nihilist that doesn't believe that there are any karmic consequences. So, but another one of their tenets of this Vedic school, not just talking about karmic consequences, but here, a self-knower in the continuum of a nihilist that experiences an inferential cognizer as being a valid cognizer. Because for, go on.
Well, we're just thinking that if an inferential cognizer is having conceptual thought, right? So if they must think it's a valid cognizer because it must be, well, certainly incontrovertible in their way, sense of thinking, right? Whatever their conception is giving them, right?
They believe that you cannot prove things by logic, by inference. It's kind of meat and potatoes. There are a lot of people like that in the world, aren't there? You can't prove anything to them, you know, it's just, what's it, some kind of thing, some kind of phrase in English about, you know, you only believe it if you see it or something like that, you know, only direct perception. Yarpel, do you know what I'm thinking of?
Yes.
What is it called? What's
The idea of if I've seen it with my own eyes.
Yeah. I don't believe, you know, supposedly you're proving this, but I've got to see it with my own eyes. I got to feel it, touch it, taste it. So they don't believe in inference. So if they were to have an inferential cognizer in their consciousness, which is a valid cognizer, that according to this view, that self-knower that's knowing that consciousness would be inattentive because they can't remember that it is a valid cognizer. Okay, you have to think about this. Maybe if you have some of the other books that we've recommended for the course, you could read those sections in there about this. This is classic examples. Okay.
See, Venerable George.
Yes.
I mean, I'm a little bit confused why they make such exotic examples, because basically, as the Mind and Tibetan Buddhism book says basically the function of these self-knowers is just so that memory functions, so we remember our previous consciousnesses. So, I mean, an example of an inattentive self-knower would be any time we can't remember a previous moment of consciousness. So every time we say, what was I thinking just now? Our self-knower at that previous moment must have been inattentive because we can't remember.
I think you could say that. Yeah, I think you could say that. Say, for instance, but generally the self-knower is not, because it's only knowing consciousness, it's not being distracted by anything else, like other, other things that an inattentive perception, other kinds of inattentive perceptions could be. Say, for instance, eye consciousness that's seeing the football game, or let's say the ballet. Say a woman watching the fashion show, and her boyfriend or husband says, let's go, with voice. So their she doesn't pay attention. She's so interested in the fashion show, or watching the Olympics. And Shankar, are you watching the Olympics at all?
No.
No, okay. That's not a good example for you. Anyone watching the Olympics? Oh, interesting. Yarpo, you watching?
Yes, I watched some highlights late at night.
Good. Okay, so someone is worldly here. Not, the rest of these people are so wonks. Yarpo at least is in the world. Rowena, you watching Olympics also?
There seems to be an interesting situation where one of the gymnasts decided she wasn't up to performing, and that set a whole wave of rather interesting comments and self-reflection around the media.
Right. Simon Biles, I think her name is. So anyway, if you're watching and you're watching the intricacy of the gymnastics or something, or the race, and someone were to say something to you, or even maybe the commentary, you can't remember what the commentator said because you were so focused on your visual consciousness. What that means is an inattentive perception is one in which your mental consciousness is not paying sufficient attention to, say, the ear consciousness, because it's so engrossed in the visual consciousness. That's just one example. You can think of many, many examples. So in the case here, a self-knower is not distracted by the other senses because it is only knowing the consciousness of itself. Amanda.
Sorry, this is a bit of a side question, but that inattentive consciousness you were describing, is that like when you might have a whole troop of monkeys that are at a temple and they're hearing the chanting, but they're not obviously paying attention to it, but they're hearing it? Is that the same sort of thing?
Maybe. I suppose some monkeys might actually pay attention to the chanting, even though they're not understanding the words, the rhythm or whatever. They could be, yeah. If something is apparent, the classic example that we often think of is if there's a car accident and a car goes by, hits someone, and what do they call it? Like scoots off, doesn't stay around. And later you ask, what kind of car was it? The police ask, what kind of car was it? What was the license plate? And you can't remember because your eye conscious, even though you might have saw the car go by, your mind was traumatized by the accident. You were thinking of the suffering or the shock, and you didn't pay sufficient attention to the eye consciousness to induce a memory of what you saw. If you get into the details about hypnosis later, then you can supposedly remember, then it was not inattentive. You did have some small attention to it that in hypnosis, you can remember it was blue or whatever. But if you can't remember it all, that was an inattentive perception.
So Venerable?
Yes.
So if you're like one of these, bodhisattvas on one of the high grounds, right? Mm-hmm. And they basically, I think one of their powers is that they can't, they sense everything, so they wouldn't have an attentive perception, basically, right?
I think if Bodhisattva was listening to the Buddha and eye consciousness focusing on his holy body, ear consciousness listening to his words, if they were bitten by a mosquito, they might be inattentive of that.
Oh.
So it doesn't mean that everything, one particular thing they're focusing on will be, they will be attentive to that, but they might be inattentive to something else because they're focusing on one thing, the holy body of the Buddha. Also, probably for many of you, if you're watching Dalai Lama in a live, you're in the auditorium and you're up close, and you're hearing, you're listening very carefully to what he's saying. You're watching his mouth. So your mind is split between those two, the visual consciousness and the ear consciousness. There's nothing. Someone pinches you. You may be completely inattentive to that, or a mosquito bites you. Okay. So let's go a little bit further because we're getting near the end here. When we talk about direct receivers, we talked about, what did we talk about? Here we talk about mental direct perceivers.
You're at yogic direct perceivers.
Yeah,
on page 15.
we talked about direct, mental, inattentive. That was the third one, right? No, self-knowing direct perceivers. So sense direct perceivers, mental direct perceivers, self-knowing direct perceivers. Now we get to the fourth division, yogic direct perceivers. So yogic direct perceivers are not in the sense consciousnesses. They are mental consciousnesses, but they have a particular kind of necessary foundation. When you've developed single-pointed concentration, shamatha, and in addition to that, you've learned how to analyze within that single-pointed concentration without disturbing the stability. That particular kind of analysis is called vipassana, or special insight. When you have a union of the two, so that you are able to hold something in mind but still be able to analyze it, that is a necessary factor. That particular state of mind is one in which you can realize selflessness directly. It's called a yogic direct perceiver. So here, definitions and divisions. The definition of a yogic direct perceiver is that which is generated in dependence on its own uncommon powering condition, a meditative concentration that is a union of calm abiding and special insight. So you have a concentrated state of mind. You're in meditative concentration, which is a union of tranquil abiding and special insight. That acts as a special empowering condition for yogic direct perceiver. It is an other knower, so it's not a self-knower, it's an other knower in the continuum of a superior. What is a superior?
Someone who's directly realized emptiness.
Right, an Arya being. It's how we translate Arya, one of the ways we translate Arya. Christine, do you know that, what an Arya being is? Yeah. So an Arya is someone who's realized emptiness directly. You might have a little doubt about this, but anyway, an other knower in the continuum of a superior that is free from conceptuality and is non-mistaken. Free from conceptuality and is non-mistaken. So free from conceptuality means that it is a direct perceiver, right? Stephen, yeah.
Oh, thank you, Venerable George. I just get confused when you use the words analysis along with vipassana, because it makes me think that, well, I think of analysis as being conceptual. So that's why I'm getting confused, even though we say that a yogic direct perceiver is free from it.
Right. So when you have a union of the two, you can use analysis to analyze, and that may be conceptual. You know, the person is either one with the aggregates or different than the aggregates. But once you have developed an inferential cognizer, which I had hoped we'd get to today, where it doesn't look like we're going to get to. An inferential cognizer is when through logic, you've proved that the self doesn't exist as inherently existent, let's say, from the Prasangika point of view. You've proved that. At that point, the state of Vipassana no longer is analyzing conceptually, it's just a wisdom consciousness. So it's said that shamatha alone, just single point of concentration, even though you've developed some logic to prove emptiness, and you have an inferential cognizer that realizes emptiness. You have a realization of emptiness. You can hold that single pointedly. That's one of the goals in the perfection of concentration. Like in the Lama Chopa, we say, you know, a meditative equipoise that holds single pointedly on that. But that state is not sufficient. That concentration on the emptiness alone is not sufficient to cease the delusions, to cut the root of ignorance. You have to have a deeper wisdom component. So that wisdom component is the what's the word? The continuation of the analysis. The analysis no longer is analyzing, but it itself is a wisdom consciousness. That Vipassana at that point, when you have a union of tranquil abiding and penetrative insight, it's no longer analyzing conceptually. It's just knowing that deeply, more than just the concentration alone concentrating on it. So if subsequently your understanding of the emptiness or selflessness begins to diminish, you may have to again enter into analysis. Then the Vipassana activates to actually conceptually analyze again. The person is at one with the aggregates, it's not different than the aggregates. If it existed, it would have to be one with the aggregates, it's not, and so forth. It comes to that conclusion again. Then not only do you have the shamatha concentrating on that, but you have the continuation of that wisdom that is like the light. The concentration is like that it's stable. The wisdom is like that the light, like looking at murals in a temple, classic example. If you have a candle that is being buffered by the wind, you just see intermittently the mural on the wall of the temple in the dark, right? You go into a temple at night and you're trying to look at something and the candle light is flickering. That's like a lack of concentration. Even if you have the concentration, if the candle is just a little, you know, there's no, say you have a little flashlight on your belt or on your iPhone or something. If it's not very bright, it may be stable because it's not being buffered by the wind, but it's not sufficient to see the details. So you need to have that union of calm abiding and penetrative insight. So this is what, when we talk about yogic direct perceiver, that which is generated into dependence on its own uncommon empowering condition, meditative concentration that is a union of calm abiding and special insight, and is another knower, other knowing, exalted knower in the continuum of a superior, as in an Arya being, that is free from conceptuality and non-mistaken. Generally, if something is free from conceptuality, isn't it non-mistaken?
No. Oh.
Okay, Bob, who could say?
Yeah, I mean, you can have a non-conceptual state that's mistaken. You know, like if you have a defective eye consciousness, for example,
right.
Things like that.
Right. All right, so free from conceptuality and non-mistaken. So there are other definitions that are given. If you want to, we'll continue. I'm just going a little bit further, but if you want to check on that, you can check in Lati Rinpoche's book. Very good explanation. I should have had my little piece of paper in there, slipped out. We're talking about yogic direct perceivers. So I think 8990, what was that? 106, 105. In the explanation of yogic direct perceivers on around page 103 and so forth, when he gives the definitions, or when he gives the definition, well, anyway, you can look in there. There's an explanation which, from the viewpoint of some of the other Gelugpa scholars, who say that Purbachok, who's the author of our text, his definition doesn't have to be stated that way, that is an other knower. So you could go into the intricacies of that. But anyway, let's go to the divisions here. When yogic direct perceivers are divided, there are two. Valid cognizers that are yogic direct perceivers. So they've realized their object. The first instant of realizing the object is a valid cognizer. If you know, you're realizing it with a yogic direct perceiver, right? Direct perception, mental direct perception, which is based on this meditative concentration union of shamatha and vipassana. The subsequent moments of that are still realizing the object, but they are not valid according to Sautrantika. According to Prasankika, they're still valid. They're still realizing the object. There are no yogic direct perceivers that are inattentive. Here it says, there are no awarenesses to which an object appears, but is not ascertained that are yogic direct perceivers, because whatever is a yogic direct perceiver necessarily ascertains its object of comprehension. Objects of comprehension are only talked about in terms of realizing consciousnesses, consciousness that realize their objects, that are incontrovertible. So they necessarily ascertain their objects of comprehension. This is because Dharmakirti's commentary on the Compendium of Valid Cognition that was written by his teacher, Dignaga, from just seeing, and he's talking about yogic direct perceiver, from just seeing, the great intelligent ones ascertain all aspects. Here it doesn't talk, sometimes when we talk about all aspects, there's one of the terms for omniscience is the knower of all aspects. Here it doesn't mean that. It just means that a direct perceiver, a yogic direct perceiver, like an eye direct perceiver, knows all of the aspects, as opposed to a conceptual mind that only knows some of the aspects of the thing, because it's what's called an eliminative engager, mental conception, right? It goes via a mental image, so you can't see all of the aspects of something with a mental conception. Although subsequent cognizers that are yogic direct perceivers exist, because we just said that's one of the divisions, the second moment and so forth of an omniscient exalted wisdom are not subsequent cognizers. This is kind of an aside by Purbachok here. Sort of, you won't necessarily see this in other texts. Some other texts might bring it up as some, subsequent ancillary point. The second moment of an omniscient consciousness is still a prime cognizer, a valid cognizer. What does that mean? Generally, for the Sautrantika and these other schools, Chittamatra and Svatantrika, Madhyamaka, the first moment is prime or valid. The second moment is not valid, but it still realizes the object. What's the differentiation? Because the first moment knows it by its own power, like the engine, remember the example, the engine of the train. The second moments are being pulled along by that. But in the case of a Buddha, even for Sautrantika, the subsequent moments engage their object by, directly themselves, not being pulled along by the inertia of the first moment. Although subsequent cognizers that are yogic direct perceivers exist, as we see, the second moment and so forth of an omniscient mind, a Buddha's wisdom, they are not subsequent cognizers, the second moment and so forth, because whatever is an omniscient exalted wisdom is necessarily a valid cognizer. This is so because, and then when you say something like this is so, you have to quote some scripture which is accepted by your debating partners, okay, if you're going to be proving something. So as we're Gelugpas, he quotes Lama Tsongkhapa's, one of his two main disciples, right? Kyabje and Gyaltsabje. So he quotes Gyaltsabje's explanation, the compendium, the unmistaken illumination to the path of liberation. What do they call Namtar Donsel, I think it's called in Tibetan. So it's his commentary to Dignaga's Pramanavartika. Anyway, all of these other words here make it sound more complicated. So Dharmakirti wrote a commentary to Dignaga, which is very, very famous. Everyone studies for logic, called the Pramanavartika. Gyaltsabje wrote his commentary to that. It says, no matter how much I turn inside and think about it, this is Gyaltsabje talking, it's analyzing. When I think about it, I do not feel that an omniscient exalted wisdom, omniscient mind, is not pervaded by being a new realizer. I do not, couple of negatives here, right? I do not feel that an omniscient cognizer is not pervaded. So it's double negative. So it is pervaded by being a new realizer. That's what he's saying. Every instant of the omniscient consciousness is a new realizer. In other words, an omniscient exalted wisdom is necessarily a new realizer. Okay, they did put it in parentheses there. Also, Kyabje, that's the other disciple of Lama Tsongkhapa, so considered by the Gelugpas to be a reliable source. Kyabje says, in Clearing Away the Darkness of Mind with respect to the treatises on valid cognition, says, if something became a subsequent cognizer merely through its objects being apprehended by a former valid cognizer, it would follow that the second and subsequent moments of an omniscient exalted wisdom would be subsequent cognizers. There exist many flaws, as will be indicated below in his text, not in this text. So they're both saying that every instant of an omniscient mind is a valid cognizer. It doesn't have to be just the first moment. Okay? So we've eaten up our time. Shankar had asked me to stop at an hour and a half. I've gone to 45 minutes sometime now. I've gone to 50 minutes, almost 50 minutes. I'm sorry, but I think it's useful, that you have, you yourselves, the participants in the course, have your chance to, raise these questions that you have or your thoughts. They enliven it. So there's always a trade-off. So let's, any last question before we end? We'll do a little dedication. Doris, you're the host. You get the first first choice.
Well, I'm supposed to get the last choice since I'm the host.
Okay.
I just want to go back to where my mind exploded there in the examples for inattentive perception. Just being very general with just ordinary words. Are they saying that, is he saying that using examples of people with different beliefs that are inattentive to they're not ascertaining according to this tenet system that, for example, with Samkhya, they believe that bliss is not a consciousness, but they're just not ascertaining that it is a consciousness.
So ascertaining here has a particular meaning. When we talk about an ascertaining consciousness, that means a consciousness that is able to induce a memory of that. So for them, holding very strongly to their own tenets, it's almost as though they're distracted by that, so that the actual experience, let's say it's a direct perceiver, the self-knowing direct perceiver for them, for Sautrantika, is an actual entity, right? It's knowing its own entity. It's knowing that it is experiencing bliss. But because of their tenets, that distracts them from that, so that that particular one is not attended to, not paid sufficient attention to give rise to a memory of that. Take a look at some of the other texts. We'll go. I'll try to go back over this again next time. I think, although Bob asked next, yeah, Bob, go on.
Mine is very short. I keep hearing this thing, exalted wisdom or whatever, or exalted consciousness,
right,
or exalted knower, I guess it is. Is that synonymous with this union of calm abiding and special insight, or is there a deeper definition of exalted? What does exalted mean in this context?
Yeah, so this is this is the Tibetan word Yeshe, like Lama Yeshe, right? Yeshe is like Sherab. Sherab is prajna, right? Wisdom. When we talk about the prajna paramita, is the perfection of wisdom. The Sanskrit word for Yeshe is jnana. J-N with an umlaut over the top, A-N-A, jnana, which means it's a deeper kind of wisdom that the bodhisattvas develop on the 10th bhumi. They have a special practice of the perfection of jnana, of Yeshe. But in their case, what that means is their wisdom not only knows the emptiness of phenomena, they know the fact that phenomena are merely imputed. They know the conventional nature of phenomena also, how it actually exists as mere imputations. But in the Prajnaparamita Sutras, when we talk about Yeshe, or here's translated exalted knower, it means something different. It doesn't mean only on the 10th bhumi. It means a path consciousness that brings about realizations. Any consciousness in the continuum of a bodhisattva that enhances their realizations is called Yeshe. So I prefer to use, rather than exalted knower, I prefer to use gnosis. You know the word gnosis? Not noses, as Lama Yeshe, as Yeshe Zopa always said. Not noses, gnosis. How do you spell gnosis? G-N-O-S-I-S, right? Gnosis is related with our English word knowing or knowledge. So it's considered to be a deeper kind of wisdom than just prajna. You don't have to talk about the perfection of gnosis on the 10th bhumi, but just in a lot of the texts earlier, they translated it as exalted knower. You could just exalted knower, 5 syllables. Gnosis is just 2 syllables. I prefer that just for brevity. So it's a deeper kind. It's something that is related with the deep realizations of the path. So in the definitions here, when it talked about an exalted knower, an other knowing exalted knower, you could say another knower, other knowing wisdom. Exalted knower just means gnosis, or this deep kind of wisdom. Okay, can I leave it at that for the time being? And Stephen, I think you were next.
Thank you, Venerable George. Quick question. So mental direct perceivers, can they ever be mistaken according to their appearing object or wrong about their engaged object?
Mental direct perceivers. So remember, one example of mental direct perceivers was dream consciousness. Do you think dream consciousnesses are factually concordant? They're true?
No, I would say not, although you are having a clear appearance of the dream to you. So it's unintermediated by meaning generality.
Yeah.
But it's a dream, right? Should I expect a dream to be factually concordant?
I mean, you shouldn't expect it. I mean, there might be some dreams that are, but generally, that's an example of a mental direct perceiver that is a wrong consciousness, right? So it doesn't, what did you say? Did it have to be?
Well, if I know it's a dream, why should I have an expectation that it needs to be factually concordant? It's just a dream.
Yeah, no, but your question was about whether direct mental perceivers, I can't remember the word you used, whether they were reliable or
whether they were either ever mistaken according to their appearing object, and there I think not, but can they be wrong according to their engaged object?
Yeah, there's no dog chasing you if that's your engaged object. The appearing object also is clearly appearing, but it does not exist in the same way that for Prasangika, what we see doesn't exist the way that it appears. For the Sautrantika, you would say the dream object doesn't exist the way that it appears. It appears to be real, but it is not real, right? So again, we'll continue with that kind of train of thought in the future. Think about it. Amanda, last question. Last call for alcohol.
Okay, so I don't have a question. I just wanted to say that how much I appreciate the effort that you go to give the class. And even though I can't follow everything, just the fact that you engage with us and like listen to us and encourage us, it's just really helpful. And thank you.
Okay, good. That's good to hear. So it's not completely. So thank you all for coming and attending. Continue on. We're going to be next talking about, we'll review a little bit about yogic direct perceivers, so you can have some questions if you read some of the other books, get some other ideas about that. Yogic direct perceivers realize their objects. Then we're going to talk about direct valid cognizers next. You can read the subsequent pages, read a little bit ahead. And those of you who have the leisure to read some of these other books, if you have this, or Mind in Tibetan Buddhism. What was the other one, Shanka, that you said that you recommended highly?
I don't know if it was highly, but this is the one that on Purvachok's text.
On Purvachok's text, so another commentary on Purvachok itself.
Which, well, only the awareness part, mind and awareness part. He does not
the
have
mental factors part.
Factors.
So Lati Rinpoche mentions Purvachok occasionally, but he also mentions some of the other Gelugpa commentators, how they say, oh, Purvachok wasn't right, or Purvachok says they're not right, or something, so that those of you who have a little more, space in your mind for these confusing things can consult those. So let's end with a little dedication. Rather than doing the prayers this afternoon, we're just going to do a mental dedication here in meditation. Still within that sphere, praying for the long life of our teachers and so forth. Think that in this morning, we've created some virtuous karma because of our motivation at the beginning, initial motivation, and the subsequent motivations, trying to understand things for the welfare of others. We've created an immense store of merit that will ripen within cyclic existence. It might ripen in the experience of something pleasurable in the future, which is experienced once and then lost, gone. But we can dedicate it to become the substantial cause of our realizations on the spiritual path, leading to renunciation, bodhicitta, and the right view of emptiness. For the purpose of our eventual achievement of enlightenment, from which state we can be over all our hang-ups, we can work for others altruistically, perfectly, spontaneously, without error. How wonderful that would be. May these merits ripen in such a way that they lead through the successive stages of the path to my achievement of enlightenment for the welfare of the world, for the welfare of all living beings. And as an aid to that, think that may our teachers, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, Dalai Lama, Lama Osel, Geshe, the teacher of the center, may they all have long and stable lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George.
Hope to see you next week. Good reading and thinking, and good questions.